Good morning. This is Josh Scherrer, author of the book 2020. Today, I am going to answer some of the questions that you had about the chapter May. So let's get right to it. Kayla asked, why did the son and dad just dig a hole for the night roamer? Did they just do it so they won't decompose, or do they feel some guilt and it feels more respectful to bury them? So the short answer is yes, they do feel a little bit of guilt. You have to keep in mind that throughout the book, especially these early chapters, Marlin in particular is struggling with the fact that he is killing people and not just animals or, some sort of creature or monster. They are people, neighbors, relatives, people that he might have known at some point. And even though these roamers were probably strangers as humans, they still are human. And so there's a little bit of guilt associated with that. And then the other part of that question is they have a concern that the infection might spread more rapidly if those roamer bodies are left to decompose out in the open. So they always bury them or burn them or whatever to try and get rid of them. At least that's kind of how the story goes. So Giselle asked, who or what was the massive shadow and why was it chasing him? So that massive shadow is kind of a plot device that we use. And so it's left to your imagination. What do you think it was based on the information of the book, based on what he's told you so far? So that's one of those secrets that an author kind of just leaves for the reader. And so it's kind of open for you to decide what that shadow was. Alessandra asked, how do they know the man was actually infected? They know just from the very subtle distinctions of what a human looks like versus someone that was infected. And it's kind of a judgment call. There is a question of morality in the book. Marlin has decided that these roamers are infected to the point that he has to kill them in order to survive. But really, in theory, if there is a cure or something that he just didn't know about, then he's really committing murder in a way. And so, the whole story, including with this one infection, is about the morality of Marlin and whether or not he's making the moral or just choice. So Devin asked, for the month of May, why do the roamers go specifically for humans and why don't they eat each other or other animals? So that's kind of an interesting question. And if you notice in the book, especially as we go through the next few chapters, there seems to be an absence of wildlife. And so even though it's not clearly stated by Marlin, the reader kind of is left to assume that the roamers have devoured everything that they can find. And so the one thing that's in abundance that we don't necessarily think about as a food source, because that's obviously not how we operate, but would be humans. Because if you've eaten all the food in the houses that have been abandoned, if you've eaten all of the pets that were in the house, if you've eaten all the wildlife, and you've just got this animalistic brain that the roamers apparently have, then the only food source that's left in their mind would be those that are not like them. And the reason why they don't eat each other or attack each other is kind of the same reason why, generally speaking, animals don't eat their own kind. Because if you eat your own kind, then you endanger your own species. And although the roamers, of course, are not a separate species than human, we guess, as readers of the book, that those roamers still carry that pack mentality. Cherokee asked, why are Marlin and his dad and mom the only people left? So we don't know for sure who all is left in the world or in the United States or in Indiana or in, that tri-state region of Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky that people commonly travel. But we do know that the infection has affected a lot of people. And so just like, he saw at the beginning of the book, the Harrisons, and then he saw the Carsons, Um, they don't necessarily exist as the only people left in the world, but they are central to the story because it's a story about Marlin. And so that's all we know. We have to force ourselves into the perspective of what Marlin can see and what Marlin knows. And that's kind of how we're limited as readers as to who's left on the earth. Hannah asks, why are they trying to start a war or go to war when they have to work? I assume you're talking about why they are going to war with the roamers. And you have to keep in mind that emotion plays a major role in who Marlin is as an individual. And so, although logically, if roamers aren't bothering you, you should leave them alone. Once you start the offensive, once you start attacking, it's very difficult to draw back and say, okay, we need to stop. We need to focus on something else. And so we can kind of see Marlin getting stuck in that trap of he wants to continue going after the roamers. Okay, Cesar asks, where are the screams coming from? The short answer, all over. We don't really know, and that's part of the horror of it, is we do not really know what's going on at night. Benjamin asks, was it right to go around killing all those roamers that did not come to their house? And was it also right to go and take supplies? Because that could be considered stealing. So very similar to the other question that we had about going to war. It's a moral choice. And so it's up to Marlin and to an extent his father and to a lesser extent his mother, of deciding what is the right choice. If you're faced with starvation, would stealing be a justified decision? And if you are so afraid of your own impending death that the only way to prevent that death is to completely eradicate or get rid of that threat, are you justified in going after the roamers? And that's something that the reader has to decide. The title is A Journal of a Man Faced with Humanity's Downfall. And so on the surface, that downfall of humanity is the fact that humans are becoming roamers. They're being infected and they're becoming less than human. But the deeper meaning of that title is Marlin is also experiencing his own downfall because his actions a few months ago in his mind would have been unthinkable, but now he is doing the very unthinkable things that he believes he has to do. Here's a good question. Addison asked, if they threw a Molotov when it was in the woods, wouldn't it set the trees and grass on fire? And so the answer is yes, it would. And so in a perfect world, if we were being very realistic, that Molotov cocktail, because it was fairly dry at the time, would probably burn down half of their property, and it would be a disaster. But the short answer for that is it was the author's choice. Sometimes you can take some liberties in fiction. And so we just kind of imagine that the alcohol that was used in that Molotov, because that's usually what they're based with, is some sort of alcohol as the accelerant for the fire. Alcohol burns very quickly, and as does gasoline. And so once that accelerant is burned out, then that fire goes out fairly quickly. So good question. It's one that I really had not thought of. But yeah, so yes, you are correct. It probably should have caught everything on fire. Jada asks, I understand roamers are bad, but what made Marlin cold so fast? When Mr. Harrison was dead, he felt bad and he knew he was infected. So what made him change so quickly? Well, that is another good question. And it kind of goes back to the fact that once Marlin gets in the mindset of survival, then what he does to survive, he justifies in his mind. So it doesn't matter to him that he's killing humans so much as he's doing it because he has to survive. And as we'll see as he writes over and over, he's doing what he's doing because he wants to survive for his family. Now, he makes some questionable decisions along the way, and we always ask ourselves, well, why does he do this and not that? But it goes back to when you are faced with a crisis, when you're faced with a challenge, what decisions do you make, and were those decisions the correct decisions? And that's what the reader has to decide from your perspective. So Tabitha asks, why are the roamers trying to eat humans? Do they have an urge to kill or to infect them? And so roamers are an interesting group because they are human, but they are not human at the same time. And so do humans have a tendency to kill, this urge to kill? It could be argued that they do, and so maybe that brings that out in the roamers. But the other part of it is, humans removed from our humanity, removed from our civility, we will resort to food, water, shelter, our three basic needs. We don't really know how the roamers shelter. It doesn't seem like they care about clothing or anything anymore because, the descriptions of their clothing being tattered and everything. They probably get water, although it's not really mentioned much in the book. And so that leaves the one other need, which is food. And so going back to that other question, why do they go after humans? Humans are food. We don't like to think of ourselves that way, but when push comes to shove, when the situation is dire, humans can be food. And so the roamers bring out that animalistic instinct, and humans become food. Okay, so the next question is from Eric, and another good question. Why didn't they bother checking the television or the radios for any signals for information of survivors? So as we go through the book, occasionally you'll hear that they flip on the news and there's not much news, or they can't get a station or whatever. And so, again, it's another one of those plot devices used in fiction. To be completely honest with you, today being 2020 in real life, you probably also do this, but I can go online and I can check, Google News, or I can go to Twitter or Instagram or whatever and find all kinds of information, at the snap of my fingers. For Marlin, though, we assume, this was written in real life in 2013. So you have to keep in mind, as the author, I'm basing the future on what I knew in 2013. If you have access to power and internet and, that type of thing to get information, you will seek it out. But back in 2013, and, in my experience before that, if one of those things was disrupted, the internet went down, or if you didn't have electricity for a while, like if you went camping or whatever, you stopped worrying about the news. And so for Marlin, in the story, as the author, I chose to make seeking out information less of a priority and make survival the priority for Marlin, and to a lesser extent his family. And so that's kind of the reason why they don't check it very often. And then, of course, the other reason is maybe they are checking it, but if you check it and you don't find anything, it's not something that you would write about. So Marlin, he may be flipping on the news every day, but if all you get is static, after a while, you're not going to write, static again, because it's something that is so automatic, you wouldn't really think to reflect on it in a journal. Okay, good question. Chelsea asked, how do you feel knowing your dad shot someone and knowing you killed someone before as well? So based on Marlin and his dad, I think Marlin understands the complexity of the emotions that his dad is going through that first time he kills a roamer. And really, thankfully, I have never had to experience that, I have never served in the armed forces, so I don't have the experience of one, having to shoot at another human being, and two, taking someone's life out of necessity. So, thank goodness for that for me personally. But, talking to friends and colleagues who were in the armed forces, they don't ever really talk about that part of their duty. And so for Marlon, it's kind of this unspoken emotion that you feel and and you want to share, but you don't really share. Okay, so going on to the next question. Why did the roamers stay in a pack? Why don't they do their own thing? Nira asked. And why does the author make the book a journal entry first person instead of making it third person? So a couple different questions there, both excellent. So the first question, why are roamers in packs? The answer to that is, based on what I know about human psychology, humans are social creatures. And that's why today, for a lot of us, this social isolation, this social distancing that we have been asked to do to, lower the number of coronavirus cases in the United States is very difficult for some people. And, so if you look on social media, you'll see people making exceptions, and they might visit somebody and stay 6 feet apart, even though technically that's not what you're supposed to do in social isolation. The reason why they do that, most likely from a psychological perspective, is because humans are social creatures. We desire that human connection. And so even though the roamers have kind of this mask on that blocks their humanity, as animals, as creatures, they are still social creatures. And so if I had to make a scientific explanation as the author, that would be why, because our instincts are to stay in a group. And so the roamers do too. And then the other point that you ask about, why was it first person? To be honest with you, there were two reasons. One is I wanted to focus on Marlon and his emotional state. And the best way to do that, the only way that you can get into someone's head as a character, is to be that character through the first person. Okay, so that was reason number one. And then reason number two, here's a little tip if you are thinking about writing your own story, your own book. If you write in first person, it's a lot easier to step into that person's shoes as the author and write from their perspective. So it's an easier form of writing than third person, because even though third person is just like, this and this and this and this, it's a lot more difficult to get into that emotion of each character, because you have to make a decision as the author when you write third person. Are you going to share everyone's emotion, which would be an omnipresent narrator? Okay, a fancy word for that is knowing everybody's thoughts. Or are you going to have limited omnipresence, meaning you only know a few people? Or are you just going to stick with the facts and not have any emotion or any thoughts whatsoever in your book, and you're just going to report the facts of the book? And so I just made the decision as the author. I wanted that first person perspective. But excellent question. I don't think I've ever been asked that, but that's why. Okay, so the next question is from Jory. What are you going to do if the house is overwhelmed with a swarm of night roamers? Like at the gas station, there are 30 plus of them. How will you react if the same amount or more came to the house seeking food? So I think that's probably why, as the author, I included the fact that they were creating a perimeter and that they were patrolling the perimeter. Because if you can be proactive, if you can stop the threat before it happens, then you are going to be able to limit that run or that attack of multiple roamers. And so that's kind of why I did that in the book as the author. But the answer, if there was an attack of 30 or more, yeah, they would have to evacuate. They would have to run. They would have to just find shelter somewhere, whether that be in that neighborhood to the north, or some other abandoned house, or if they just all pile in to the truck and they head off somewhere else. We don't know at this point what's going to happen, but they would have to just get out if they could. Okay, so Cecilia asks, is Indiana the only one that has infected people? We know for a fact, in terms of the book, Kentucky has roamers, because that's where Marlin was originally from, and Indiana has roamers. And we assume, because of the way the book started, with the signals going down and not having any real information out of New York and Chicago and those other major metropolitan areas, that something is going on. We just don't know for a fact that it is roamers. But yeah, it's a national issue, to answer your question. Jayla asked, what were you thinking, like bad or good thoughts? Do you think you could have done something? So as the author, I tried to do my best to place myself in Marlin's shoes, and that's kind of why I wrote the book, because having done a lot of research with human psychology whenever I was in college, and just looking at the philosophical part of it, human morality is a very interesting issue. We all say that we have certain moral standards. We'll do this and this and this, and we judge people all the time. But if you are faced with a crisis, if you are faced with a decision that has no good outcome, kill a roamer or be killed, what choice are you going to make? And so I don't know personally what I would do if I was faced with a situation like that. I don't know if my instincts would take over and I would just try and survive, or if I would, they say fight or flight are your two main reactions, instincts. So I don't know if I would fight, and I don't know if I would run away and, flight. I don't know if I would take off. And then, of course, the third option, which probably isn't the best option, is you just surrender and you let fate take over. So I don't know. That's a good question. Carla asked, I wonder what's going to happen next, like if he meets another person. So stay tuned, Carla. You will find out. Brianna asked, when he was in the storm, he locked everything up and he had hid. My question is why he hid with a gun. Because, it's not necessarily the storm itself that he had a gun for. It was what would happen after the storm. Because the storm, as you know, if it damages things, it could knock out the generator. It could knock out the fencing. It could allow roamers into that area. So that's why he hid with the gun. Abraham, how did it feel writing this? So I kind of mentioned that with Jayla's question, but it felt very surreal writing it because I wanted it to be based on the real world, and I wanted it to be based on a situation that could potentially happen. Like, I didn't want to write just some random zombie thing where, it's a zombie virus and now they're the living dead and they're coming out of their graves. I wanted it to be as realistic as possible, yet at the same time understanding that that type of pandemic, that type of virus is very unlikely to occur, simply because in nature, viruses usually don't react like that. And as we'll find out, it's not even a virus. It's actually like a protozoa, a little tiny microscopic organism. They don't usually react like that in nature. So the likelihood of that type of pandemic happening, very small. But I did, like I said, I did want to look at those moral choices. And hopefully I did a pretty good job of looking at those. But again, that's kind of for the reader to decide how I did. Alexander asked, what will happen when all the gas runs out of the generator and it can't power the electricity anymore? So that is kind of the burning question. And that is why Marlin and his dad go into town, really for the sole purpose of getting gas. And, of course, supplies when you can get them. But without gas, there's not really any power. Without power, there's not really life, at least not life that they are very familiar with. Beth C asks, how did the machine break at the beginning of May? Uh, I think, if I recall, you're talking about the generator. Generators break down. It's kind of a plot device. I think also I mentioned in there that the generator that he took had been shot at as he was going out in April. Things happen. I don't really. There's not really a good answer for that one, I guess. Fabiola asks, why would someone fill the gas cans without you knowing? Do they have some hate? Not really sure what you're asking there, but I will say that the world in Marlin's story is a very strange place. And so what people do in the book is a reflection of a possibility for what people could do in reality. And it's just a question of whether or not they would choose that fate or not. All right, I didn't really answer that question, kind of danced around it. Sorry about that. Johanna asks, my question for the author is, how are they going to keep salvaging materials from the town if they run out? That is the $1 million question. What happens when you run out of supplies? Do you just live off of the land and start making stuff out of sticks and branches, or do you expand out and go farther into the region? Like Boonville is fairly small, and then Evansville is next to it. And then, of course, if you go far enough north, you have Indianapolis, and you go even farther, you have Chicago. Do you keep going out and keep searching for things, or do you just kind of hunker down and do your best? So, okay. Alejandra asks, how did he feel every time he killed someone and buried them? Did he feel some type of way, or did he have no emotion toward it? So Marlin's emotion changes as we go through the book. At first, he reflects on each death, but in the moment, a lot of times he's kind of numb to it, and that's probably the best description of how Marlin is turning. He is turning numb. He uses the phrase cold over and over as far as his emotions. When you are cold emotionally, you don't really feel anything, and it's not because you don't want to. It's just because you are so overwhelmed that you protect your own mentality by shutting out emotion. And so that's kind of how Marlin gets as we go through the book. Maria asks, how would you have defended yourself if in your country the use of guns is illegal and you did not have one? It is a very good question. I don't know how the book would have turned out if we were writing it from the perspective of a country that didn't have protection of gun laws, like in the Second Amendment. Would they? Well, I'll take it a step back. So there is a movie, and I don't remember the name of it, but it came out of Great Britain. It's a zombie movie, and you guys might know what I'm talking about. You might not. It doesn't really matter. But in Great Britain, they don't have guns, not very easily anyway. Okay, most civilians do not own firearms. And so in that movie, coincidentally, although it's a zombie movie and it's kind of a spoof of other movies as a comedy, they just resort to using, handheld weapons. So if something gets close, you smack at it. You try and kill it that way. So it would be very different in that it would be much more intimate. It would be much more close combat, if you will. But in America, we've got guns, and that really kind of molded how the story went as far as how those roamers would attack and how Marlin and his allies, his friends, his family would attack back. Good question. Okay, and let's see. Kylan asks, why does the character feel that way about his dad when he shot someone, even though he did the same thing? So I kind of addressed this earlier. It's this unspoken emotion that they have. Marlin knows how his dad feels, but at the same time, he can't really talk about it because it's something you don't have the words to talk about. And I think that's kind of what Marlin felt as he was writing his journal. And then finally, the last question for the month of May, Javon asked, how long do you think it took them to get the supplies? So it kind of varies as we go through the book. Usually it's 1 or 2 days whenever they make their trips into Boonville. And keep in mind, living in a rural part of the country, specifically in southern Indiana, it's kind of the common practice to stock up on your goods, your quote-unquote supplies, your food, whatever. So I can remember growing up, I grew up in a rural part of Indiana. We would typically only go to the store, twice a month, if that, once or twice a month. So we had a lot of supplies, a lot of food already on hand at the house. And so we imagine that Marlon's parents, even before the crisis, even before the outbreak of the TBR, they probably already had supplies on hand. And so, a lot of the supplies that they're getting is to restock and resupply, and it's not necessarily that they are getting things from scratch. Okay. All right, so that ends the month of May. I hope I was able to answer some of your questions. I really enjoy reading your questions and kind of getting the insights that you guys have as readers. I hope you continue to enjoy the book. I will be creating, I'm trying to think here. It will be answer session number 3. I'm actually going to create that very soon. And that will be over the month of June. So stay tuned for that one. Until then, take care, and I will see you soon.